Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for July 14th, 2023. My name is Tom Luongo, and we have a lot to talk about. It is episode 151, and I have the great pleasure of sitting down again with one of my favorite guests. Alastair Crooke is back with me this morning. We haven't had a chance to chat in quite a long time, and I'm I think right now, post-NATO, post-Vilnius, post-calling off World War III, at least for about 6 months or so, I thought it was an absolutely perfect time to sit down and chat. So I pinged him. We put this together quickly, and there we are. Alastair, how are you this morning? I'm gratified to know that your health has improved dramatically. So welcome to the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me anyway.
Oh, you're more than welcome, sir, as always. So I was confused and gratified, I think, in some ways, that they called off World War III at Vilnius at the NATO Summit, because really leading into it, it felt like they were going to do all the things that that the world didn't want them to do. They were pushing for Ben Wallace to become the new general secretary. They were trying to figure out how they can backdoor Ukraine into NATO and create all these tripwires and red lines and whatnot in order to officially make the push and set everything up for at least later this year. And somehow that didn't happen. And I was wondering what you thought about it. I have some thoughts about it, but they're kind of jumbled and still not really formed yet. Part of my terrible reason for wanting to have you here, because maybe you'd help me get some clarity on this. So I'm nothing if not self-serving when it comes to these things sometimes. So why don't you start there? Why don't you tell me and tell everybody what you think happened at Vilnius and why they couldn't make a real decision on going much farther forward than where they have so far?
I think because they're reeling from a number of events. Certainly the Europeans are reeling from events that, every decision that they'd made, which they thought was going to be quick and easy, have failed. They thought it was, they first of all imposed sanctions, financial war on Russia, and it was going to be quick. And the French finance minister said, it'll be over in a few weeks and they'll have collapsed and life will go back to normal. And it didn't happen. And then the Europeans had another thing. They said, well, we won't buy any more energy. And then Russia won't be able to sell any, and so they'll collapse. And that didn't work either. And then they've been building up the forces for this offensive. And, Zelensky was told, you've got to do this offensive, you've got to take ground, you've got to break through, you've got to go to Mariupol, that is on the Black Sea, and be able to sort of cut off Crimea. It's always Crimea. It's going up to Crimea. It's got to be Crimea. You've got to do this with your offensive. And they pumped it full. There was extra what remained of the armories of ammunition, the 155 millimeter ammunition that they use in the artillery, all of that's been used. Europe is empty of artillery, and so is America, apart from cluster shells, which they're sending now because there's nothing else. And they were talking, and everyone was geared up, psyched up. This is going to be the big offensive. It's going to sweep across, and nothing happened. The Russians have got the defensive lines prepared, carefully prepared. And, then it became very apparent that the whole of this doctrine of the offensive that the Ukrainians have been pressed to follow came from the Iraq War. It was 73 Easting, Battle of, in Iraq, where a tank, American tanks suddenly found they were in a dust storm facing off to the Republican Guard tank system. And they weren't supposed to. And the Republican Guards actually had a private agreement that they weren't going to fight the Americans in this. But, they were in a dust storm and they were sort of facing off one another, and they knocked the Iraqi tanks. I mean, they weren't wanting to fight anyway. They knocked them for 6. So the whole thing was based on this sort of idea that it was like Iraq in the desert, and Ukraine should have the Leopards and the tanks, Challenger tanks from Britain and from France and from everywhere virtually. And then they would come and they would storm the defense lines. And the practice is that, I mean, what worked in the desert was, many years ago now, and it was in very difficult. And really the battle outcome, which has become a myth for NATO, is really, it was fortuitous, as I say. It was because it was in a dust storm. They had no chance. And anyway, the Republican Guards were primed and were expecting to withdraw and move away. So, okay, it was a victory and it's become mythical and it's become the doctrine. And so they used it. And of course, the Russians who started all this had built the defensive lines in such a way, that the Ukrainians, they were brilliant defensive lines because you fed in from one direction and you got into an artillery, if you like, channel where you're going to be mashed by the artillery. They didn't even get to the first line of the defenses, not even to first line. They tried to take a few villages beyond the gray zone in this sort of area, which the Russians call, I think, quite a good word for it, crumple zones, where they sort of go back and then they come back into it, etc. And the Russians had prepared the minefields carefully. This was General Surovikin did this all last September, and the time prepared this. They have systems that when you go into a minefield, then artillery fires more mines behind you, so you can't get out again once you're in it. and NATO has just been shocked by the sight of all these Leopards and Bradleys as burnt out hulks. I mean, really, they've lost about a third of everything that they've been given in this period in terms of advanced tanks, armored carriers. And so, I mean, the question, and Zaluzhny, who is the chief of defense staff, General Zaluzhny, chief of the Ukrainian, we know pretty with quite a lot of confidence, he was saying to Zelensky at that time, he said, look, this is pointless. We don't have air cover. We're getting mauled in the minefields. The Russians are just sitting there with massive artillery, 3 times it. The numbers of their men outnumber ours. And we're just being decimated in these things. And we should go into a defensive position. We should give it up. And then he was sort of temporarily sacked. And a new general, Syrskin, came in, who's been wasting more Ukrainian men with sort of little operations around Bakhmut, which have all failed. Meanwhile, the Russians have started their offensive up north, coming in through Kharkov province, and have started to move. They've moved 150,000 of their reserves quite close up to that border. During the Prigozhin affair, Rebellion. They actually mobilized and moved people up along that border. And so, I think that, and also then, the West really was sort of salivating that Prigozhin was, they were going to see all the cracks appearing in Moscow. Russia was failing. It was, Putin was weak. There would be lots of problems. We'd see Russians killing Russians. And then, rather as I expected and said, within a few hours, it was all resolved. And Prigozhin supposedly was going off to Belarus. Actually, he's there. And so NATO's looking at this and saying, and what's happened? He was in the Kremlin on the 29th of June with all the commanders sitting down and having tea with Putin. I mean, what's going on? So right. I think they really are sort of were knocked back, and so what happened in Vilnius was really quite bad-tempered. I mean, they're trying to pretend it was a great success, of course, because that's what they would need to do. But it wasn't. There was a lot of fighting. The Hawks were unhappy. Eventually, it was Scholz and Biden who said, no way joining, giving them Article 5 at the stage of the war. It's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. We're going to not even do it through NATO. We'll just have a series of, if you like, multilateral agreements for providing support from separate and individual G7 and other states.
Mm.
So it's not even coordinated any longer under a sort of NATO rubric. I expect it will be, but it's not formally like that. It's just individual states choosing to give what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And no wonder Zaluzny had a meltdown at that point. He had blood on his hands, I'm afraid to say. I mean, because they put in all these men to try and get some achievement in the hope that this would open doors in NATO. Right. And it got nothing except that they were going to have they already have a NATO-Ukraine commission, it's now a NATO-Ukraine council that they've got. That's all they've got out of this with us. So he was very, very unhappy. And then the next day they span it and said, oh, he was told to cool it. And the next day he was thanking everyone. He wasn't. Actually, he was still so bitter and tied up that he was deeply sarcastic. And he was sort of saying to people like Wallace of the Ukraine, saying, how many times is it you'd like me to ring you up and say thank you? If I ring you first thing in the morning and then ring you again to say thank you. And then he did a little video where he did, tried to do all the thank yous in 1 minute. How many thank yous could he get through? I mean, quite clear he is deeply better about the things. Well, so it's a mess.
It is truly a mess, and that was the sense I got. I didn't follow the particulars. I just figured that once we had an outcome from them, we'd know what it meant. And and leading up to this, I wrote a bunch, and I know you did too. That I just thought that the factions within and everybody's own individual imperatives and agendas were on full display. How much France was trying to backbite Germany and the UK, and everybody was triangulating off of each other in order to get what they wanted, and no one could. And eventually, everything just kind of canceled each other out, and we wound up, if you think of it in mathematic terms, all of these different vectors like sum to nothing. Then they go, oh well, they can do this little thing, and then, at the end of the day, they got to leave Zelensky out to dry. And so it's really interesting.
They turned their back, but they did a couple of stupid things too. Right. I mean, France and Britain said, well, we're going to send long-range cruise missiles to Zelensky. Right. Well, I mean, you've only got to look at his psychological state at the moment to understand what that's going to mean. Right. I mean, he's not going to use them internally, as he promised. These are the French, and the Storm Shadow and things like that. Mm-hmm. They have a range of about 300 kilometers. I mean, he's going to use them against Russia and try and provoke something as much as he can. I don't think they won't reach Moscow, but I mean, they'll use them anyway. I mean, what was the point of this? What's the point of this?
Well, I mean, okay. So one of the things I've been thinking about, and you're right. What is the point from a tactical position in trying to win a war in Ukraine? Probably very little. What I've been thinking is when I started looking at what it's almost like NATO felt like parts of NATO were post-Ukraine already, and they now wanted to move on to the next phase of their operation. So the thing that's been popping into my head is that I keep going back to Macron and his lust for an EU army, and kind of how can we create a post-NATO Europe, and so that France can be the arms dealer of a post-NATO Europe along with the Germans. And this is how they're going to reorient the German industrial complex if any of it survives the next 5 years. And that's kind of what it feels like to me. So we'll give them. I don't think. I mean, you're right in one sense, but we're not nearly at that sort of point at this. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, about Macron, because he's very much in the news and things. But Russia pays no attention to Macron or to any Europeans. And within the European Union, I keep saying to people, forget what Macron is saying about these things. He has probably less influence in the EU at the moment than Lithuania. Really?
Lithuania is probably has more influence because they are backed by the United States and Poland and things like that. The center of power has moved to the east and to the Baltics and to Poland and to these former East European states. And it's not with the West Europeans at all. The West Europeans are going to pay the economic price, but it's he who wags the tail of the dog is going to be in the East. So I don't think so. I mean, they still hope what they gave the neocons, if you like, the hawks from Europe and America in Vilnius was saying, well, okay, you can try until the winter sets in. I mean, in practice, what's that mean? It's really August,
Right.
because September, because I don't know. I mean, by November, we're talking about snow, but October, it's rains, I think, in that. And it's not easy to rain and mist and fog and everything. So we're talking about, so they say, you've got this period, you've got to really do it. I mean, the aim of this the whole plan that has collapsed was that, there'll be this great sort of offensive by Ukraine. It would move through to the Baltic. It would cut off Crimea. And at that point, they would declare Ukraine part of NATO. And therefore Article 5, and that would freeze Putin in that situation. And then they'd say, okay, Putin, now you have to just accept it and say, do what we're imposing a ceasefire on you.
Yes.
And they're still thinking about how to sort of an orderly descent down towards, let me put it more clear, because that was too general, because I think Biden, the Biden is pulled in two ways. I mean, he's got the Blinken, Newland side pulling, with whom he's quite closely sort of in emotional sympathy. But then there's the DNC and the campaign and the need to put a democratic platform out for the election as the DNC sees it. And they know that Biden is not getting great traction at the moment in the polls and the public sphere.
Yep.
So they're not keen. They'd like to sort of see a loss, but not a loss. That it is sort of, it's loss, but no Kabul, no humiliation.
Right.
It's a sort of gentle, sort of orderly removal.
Right.
But that ignores the fact that, they're not going to get a frozen conflict. They're not going to get that possible because it's not in Russia's interest.
No.
Russia has complete escalatory dominance over the situation. It can change, open a new chapter whenever it chooses. It has, 750,000 men in Ukraine at the moment, is recruiting more every day. I mean, the recruits are going up.
So correct me if I'm wrong. You just said 750,000 in Ukraine. No, not in Ukraine, on the border.
Well, it's not. They're in the theater. They're
in theater.
Allocated to the Ukrainian theater.
Okay.
They're not reserves of Russia in Russia. There are those separately. These are Ukrainian reserves earmarked for Ukraine rather than reserves that are necessary within Russia. That's a separate category.
Just wanted to make sure we clarified that.
We're moving up to sort of a bigger army. So we'll see. My guess is, but this is just because I don't know what, I think that the Russian defense staff probably have, plans A to F. And what after Vilnius, they're going to decide which to pull out.
Right.
And I don't know any of them. But I think my guess, my feeling from Moscow and from everywhere is that they are not looking to have one of these sort of Western, massive attacks with sort of dead people across the field in that way, because they don't want Russian casualties in this process. And I think people forget, because we get so much of military analysis all the time, which we need, and is very good, a lot of it, but it dominates. And we ignore the fact that there are many means that Russia can bring about its dominance of the thing. I mean, one thing is by simply eroding the whole infrastructure of the state. They've already eroded more than half of it. I don't know whether it's 80 or 90% or something like that, but it would probably take 24 Zihal hypersonic missiles, and they might take it right down to 1% or so. And then they could also, I think, as one thing, The second thing is that they could do without, as I say, huge casualties and dead Ukrainians. They could simply also take out the control centers, the joint control bases. They've done some of that, but especially to France and Britain for bringing on these cruise missiles, these long-range cruise missiles. They're going to be targeted, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Then they can do something I would think the next thing would be to get rid of Starlink, jam it out of the system. And then also, these intelligence aircraft which fly over Ukraine all the time. The Russians don't do anything about them, but they're not very maneuverable. They're big electronic aircraft. I think if they sent up a few fighters to sort of disrupt them and to persuade them that they need to return to base ASAP, and then they can hug Kiev, just put a band around Kiev and just sit there like Aleppo. You recall Aleppo where everything was done. They'll leave a little road in and out. So, it's not total. And they'll just sit there for a month and they will say eventually, we've got an offer which we don't think you can refuse. Also with your Italian background, you'll understand quite what sort of offer will be made. And I think this is, I'm only guessing, but I'm just saying there are ways it can be done. And this is important. I was going to say very important because the next sort of friction point, I believe, is going to be August. Because if the Russians now do their offensive, which I think they must do, not if only because of public opinion in Russia, which is becoming very, very bitter that it hasn't been done before. And I think, we talk endlessly about Biden's election, but Putin has election next year too. And I think he'll want most of it to be done by then. And Putin has said very clearly, and others reflecting Putin, that as far as they're concerned, they don't want that Kiev entity to exist any longer.
Right.
Medvedev says, what happens then? Who is in leadership? I don't know. And then we don't want any more of the forces, if you like, on the ground. And Putin specifically himself says it. The war comes to an end when there are no Ukrainian forces in the field and no NATO weapons in the field.
Right.
Which is not, as I say, I think, suggesting that they're about to do talks on a ceasefire at this point. I think they are going to move either in some way, either militarily or in some of the ways I've suggested. And the question is what, and this is what I want to put to you, and not to me.
Right.
What does Biden do when the thing goes south in August in Ukraine in terms of, American perceptions? Oh my God, Ukraine might not be here in a few weeks. It might be completely gone. And they've withdrawn from Kiev to Lvov. And, that's all that's left. And do something.
Right.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, that's the big question. The one thing I'm going to say is that just thinking back before I answer that question, I wanted to pull something out that I remember you saying earlier in the podcast, which is that the Russians are now starting to push to the north, which gives credence to everything you just laid out, right? That they're starting to push towards Kharkov, and because now they've, as the Ukrainians have pushed south, the Russians are now moving on the northern front, and they have Wagner is now in Belarus. Prigozhin's rebellion has. One other thing I want to say is notice how well Putin handled Prigozhin and Wagner and everything else, that he both satisfied the hardliners within Russia while also fortifying his own, for lack of a better term, moderate approach to how things are going, because he needed to do that in order to shore up and start quelling some of the hardliners that clearly the Ukrainians and the Brits and the Poles have been trying to escalate and activate within Russian society. So I found Putin's handling of this very Putin, which is never throw a good asset away. If you can take an asset that's turned against you and turn him back to you in some way, it's usually better than just throwing them away. So Prigozhin and all of Wagner is now an asset, because then sometimes when you have an adversary and you show mercy, then you sometimes get even more loyalty than you had previously.
I think the other thing that he did, which was very well handled, was he said, okay, to the commanders and all of those, okay, we're going to sort it out, the legal things, and we'll get all that fixed, and you'll have contracts, you can fight. But by the way, you are fighting for the motherland, not for Prigozhin. Yes. You're fighting for the motherland.
Right.
And that was a really important message that he got, because Prigozhin has had too much publicity and everything. They're sort of minimizing him now. They're not going to get rid of him or anything, because he was the thing, it was not quite as it seems, that operation.
Yeah. And I was going to say, and I agree with that, because it makes sense, because Wagner's popularity with the Russian people is very, very high. I think, and Putin had acknowledged that. So adding them into the Russian military in that respect has got to be a massive PR win. Just thinking about it strategically. So as far as Biden is concerned, if the Russians do some form of what you just laid out, and have a successful military campaign in the north, for example, and start taking back all that territory that they quote unquote lost last year, that the neocons still remind us how, valiant the Ukrainians were while the glass cannons all retreated. Sorry, I still think that was 90% retreat and 10% offense on the Ukrainians' part, and 90% retreat on the Russians' part. I know I have people around me who disagree with that assessment. That's fine. We can agree to disagree. As far as Biden's political response is, it all depends on who he actually is owned by now. Because Biden he's like the new John McCain. He's owned by everybody, right? He's so corrupt. The Chinese have got their hands into him. The Brits have got their noses up his ass. I mean, everybody has a piece of Joe Biden and or the Biden family and the whole Biden infrastructure that is the quote unquote administration. Okay, so now you ask yourself the question. Okay, so who actually will be dominant over him in a couple of months? Will it be Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan? I don't think so. I think this whole episode that you just described with the failed Ukrainian offensive is going to put Nuland and company on their back feet. Like they can't even get people to show up to a meeting anymore, right? When Blinken can barely get to the table to talk to the Chinese. This is serious. Like the U.S. Secretary of State can't meet with the leadership of the Chinese, and yet somehow Janet Yellen can go, right? The Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury. And to those Bitcoiners out there who are yelling at me this morning saying, oh, by the way, what happened to your prediction to President Yellen? I'm like, it came true. She's the one meeting with Xi, not Joe Biden. So she may not be president, but she's president. Okay. So I don't know at that point what the DNC does, because they clearly are going to have to then turn around and start turning their messaging internal. I think that we're dealing now with the after effects of the Fed's incredibly aggressive interest rates, and their plan is to blame the recession on the Federal Reserve. This is another losing strategy for them, by the way. I don't know that we even care about Ukraine anymore. The only people in the United States who really care about the Ukraine at this point are the people within the Beltway bubble and the military contractors and those attendant people. Everybody else, and everybody still gaslit the 45 people that watch CNN and read USA Today. The rest of us have all moved on from this, and it is only the media that, in my mind, is carrying the water for, GCHQ and the British neoconservative establishment and the think tanks on K Street and the rest of them that are still pushing this narrative. But you'll note that when you look at the ultra hawks like the Nikki Haley's and the Mike Pence's and whatnot, that they've thrown up now as GOP candidates to waste time on the stage, none of them are getting any traction whatsoever. None. They've got 1-2%.
They
So,
got,
and those numbers are not even, those numbers are rounding errors.
were they given an offer and said, look, put your hat in the ring because Trump will never be allowed to stand?
Of course.
Were they given that? Yeah.
Of course. I mean, they're there as fallback plans so that they can then craft an election that will have no meaningful choice between the
uniparty is reestablished.
Yes, that's.
By the way, I just wanted to insert a congratulations to you, because you're one of the very, very few who've been so right about, much of what's been happening financially with seeing the strategic financial thing and not getting preoccupied with sort of narratives and markets up and down and things like that. And that's tremendous. And it's worked out as very much as you said, although now we're going to, I think, move into a different phase altogether. So we're going to, I don't know how things are going to be managed and so on. It's going to be much more difficult. I agree with all of what I'm sure all of what you said is right, but I just think we don't want to flare up in August that, that it suddenly panics the DNC and says, you've got to show how tough you are. But by the way,
well, I mean, they are trying to. I think that the plan. I think Martin Armstrong has talked about this a great deal. About what he's hearing, internally, is that they're desperate to try and run Biden as a war president because that's the only way they can win. And so, if they can figure out some way of getting that done, Alastair, then absolutely, that's what they're going to do.
But they can't. And that's the point. What we've seen, and I just want to underline it because I think many of your listeners, who are used to being told about that America has the biggest and the strongest and the best armed forces in the world. They certainly have the biggest defense budget in the world. But really, there's no NATO. There's no NATO. The Europeans would be hard pressed to put, a few thousand in the field. Britain, could do maybe 3,000. It has 40 tanks left. It has no shells left. It's the same across Europe. There's nothing in the armories. There's nothing left. They haven't got troops to put in. Yes, it's possible you could put American troops in, but I'm sure the DNC would say, no way you're putting American
I think the Pentagon is saying no. I think it's very clear that the Pentagon has no interest in fighting the Russians at this point.
And because everyone has discovered that Europe and America completely screwed up their supply lines for military logistics. They don't have any. And the Russians have them running at full speed. 24 hours are working 7 days a week, churning out shells, tanks, aircraft, whatever. This was the old Soviet thing. They removed the whole of their factories and took them over the Altai Mountains and re-established them away from the Germans. They believe in logistics.
They have a different
they haven't got any now.
They have a different approach to logistics than we do, and they have a lot of logistical issues projecting outside of Russia itself. This whole idea that they've sold. Frankly, dumb Americans and dumb Westerners, this idea that the Russians want to reinvade all of Western Europe or Eastern Europe and into Western Europe is dumb. The Russians can't do this. The rail gauges are all wrong. The Russians don't do logistics by road. They do it by rail. But internally within the Russian Federation, absolutely, they've
got it completely,
right.
But only these stupid people in the West who bought into this because they can't get this is exactly what happened in the Second World War. Russia is weak. Russia's logistics are not going to. Germany is going to win the war because it's logistics. Russia has no intention of fighting in that way. In Europe. This is the whole reason that they've moved to a completely new plane of hypersonic missiles and things, which change everything. We go on and on hearing about nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, and people don't understand there's no point to them anymore because it's gone. Why use a tactical nuclear weapon which sort of erases everything in a town completely when you've got these extraordinary hypersonic big weapons that can go through a tower block in the case of the security, and explode the basement out of it. I mean, you don't have to take out Kiev with all of these things. It's changing. You know, West is still thinking tanks and infantry. And the infantry today are drones. And the tanks of today are cruise missiles and drones that are operated or coming from the sea or elsewhere. Russia is not about to, and has no desire to move into all this nonsense about, and Europe saying that they're going to build a new army. It will take them 20 years if they ever get around to it. It's just pipe dream nonsense, I think. But NATO's broken. Its doctrines don't work.
No. And I think that was part of what I was getting at earlier when I was trying to interject the stuff about Macron. I personally think that has been the plan all along, which was to bring NATO up to this brink of quote unquote potency, and then have it fail so that it can be exposed as not working, so that the longer term strategy could be could start the process of breaking NATO down, removing the United States. But the problem is removing the United States from Europe and then allowing Europe to act independently. But the goal at the same time had to be to destroy the U.S. as a power, politically, legally, militarily, culturally, and everything else. That's bits and pieces of that are still running in place. Biden is, and the myth of Biden as president, I think, is the best symbol of that.
I think it's changed a bit, though, Tom. Mm-hmm. I think it's changed a bit, and I would agree. And there was that, from the Davos and from all of that at some point. But now, the European leaders are panicked because they are trapped. They've trapped themselves. They made all these lousy decisions and have put the whole of the economic future of Europe, made it hostage. To Ukraine. I mean, everything, the growth, the industrial, the business plan of Europe, they've just mortgaged everything for that. And I think they are really terrified now about, the consequences of those terrible decisions for which there's been no thinking, no assessment of those ideas. And I think now they're just desperate. And I think when they're desperate, they cling on to Biden and they cling on to Washington because they're frightened that, otherwise they're out, finished and gone. And of course, Europe is going, it's what we saw in Paris is really serious, because there are no solutions to these things now. It's gone past, these are structural problems that there is no solutions at all. I can explain that if you want, but that's a short answer.
Well, let's just finish up this thread about how NATO is, because I really do think this is important. And then I want to delve into the what you think is going on within France structurally. I think it's an incredibly important part of the conversation. So I do see this as the kind of, it's not, I hate to use the term at this point because they've done it in so many other ways, but peak NATO, right? We've hit this moment of NATO is going to get as big as they want, right? They've got paths for Sweden and Finland, and, they want to now they got pledges from South Korea and to fold in AUKUS and all these grand plans, but this is all just nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. And a perfect example is Erdogan in Turkey. They got Erdogan to agree to allowing Sweden a path to membership, but they didn't actually get membership, and he still got his F-16s, right? And he got he took his IMF loan. I wonder if for the first time ever, if Erdogan got a loan from the IMF that someone doesn't pay back, actually have to pay back. That would be interesting, because he said he would never take $1 from the IMF, right? That's
what he got. That's what Biden offered him. The F-16s were the public part, but he needed
the money because we did destroy their economy by pulling tens of billions of dollars out of the economy. So Erdogan is in a tenuous position. He's not in a particularly strong position.
Yeah.
So I look at all of this and I say, okay, Yeah, like Turkey wants to be a member of the EU. Why? Like, no, that's Erdogan throwing
Oh yeah,
that's
no,
just Erdogan throwing something out there for the EU to make everybody look, to dress everything up for NATO. It's not important. So if NATO is now like having reached that moment, and it's clear that we're on some kind of path to the end of a path to the end of the conflict in Ukraine vis-a-vis the Russians, at least for now, right? That maybe that's possible. Then this is a very good thing, because what's actually, in my mind, what now happens is that once these things recede from the public consciousness, now everybody can turn their attention away from this distraction towards the real issues, which are the financial ones. And I'm beginning to see the sniffing out of these things in the financial markets. And I can think that, like when everybody's got war on their head in their brain, then everybody is like, okay, I don't know what to do. I just know I need to get the ground. But now that there's the threat of a wider conflict recedes, now they can start to go, wow. Now they can actually start to look at balance sheets again, things that matter, like national balance sheets, debt to GDP ratios, the basic stuff, inflation, all the rest of it. So that's and that then is what ties back into, I think, what some of the social unrest you're seeing in France, all of the governments that are beginning to collapse across Europe and all of the rest of it. So go from there. And then let's talk about France for a bit.
Okay, I just need, not for you so much, but for your listeners to sort of say, at the end of the two wars, there was a sort of sense, very deep sense amongst Europeans that they needed to reintroduce fairness into society. I mean, don't forget, it was the Industrial Revolution before it, and it was not pretty. It was a very ugly, unfair, unjust system, feudal system, industrial feudalism. And there was a sort of sense after the war they needed. This doesn't mean they wanted socialism. I mean, some wanted not only socialism, some wanted communism. Some states did go down that road. But there was a sort of sense that we need to have some sort of values put back into economics, some sort of sense of ethics somewhere in the structure. It was not articulated very, very, very well with that. And of course, it went wrong. It sort of became too big and things. And then we got to the state where we couldn't really afford that we couldn't afford ourselves anymore because it was too big. And then came along the Chicago School. And they came and they told people like Mrs. Thatcher, they did specifically tell Mrs. Thatcher and other leaders the same thing. Oh, get rid of the shipbuilding industry. What are you doing building ships, for God's sake? Get rid of it. Send it to Asia. Get rid of car manufacturing. Send it away. The Germans didn't listen on that point, by the way.
They didn't.
But the others, but she did, and got rid of all of these manufacturing plants. And it became financialized, capsized into extreme hyper-financialism. And she was told by Chicago and the people that came there, we've got to do this and to have, financial markets for everything. And you've got to privatize and you've got to break it all down. And of course, all these privatized industries, of course, have been asset stripped and are not working any longer. It's gone from one extreme to the other extreme, if you like, in this. But the problem is that this was seen long ago by Friedrich List and others, Count Sergei Witte and others, and he said, if you capsize your economy too much to a consumer economy, to consumption, and to services, consumption of services, and you ignore the real economy, you get to the point where you cannot any longer provide employment and you can't provide jobs for people. They can't afford to buy their houses. They can't afford to send their children to university. And you will then not be able to sustain yourself. You need self-reliance. You ignore the real economy, you get rid of manufacturing, you offshore it, and then you will not be able to sustain people. And this is what we've got. People say, but why don't people take jobs? Ask any millennial in Europe and they say, we don't want your shitty jobs, thank you very much, in Amazon or in a, flipping hamburgers and things for mediocre or wages. I won't even say what happens in the south of Italy in terms of pay, what people are paid. So, I mean, this is what's gone wrong, and there's no remedy for it because there's no solution from the left. The right are not allowed to express an opinion. And so the thing just deteriorates and deteriorates because we're going deeper and deeper into dysfunctionality. Slowly, the whole structures of the state are stopping working properly. I mean, they started off doing it deliberately as part of the sort of pandemic structures, but now it's got its own momentum. And, airports don't work, water supplies don't function. All these things are just crashing around. And there's no leaders and there's no politics. And they got rid of political parties and creating the center uniparty model in Europe. And so France is in a serious trouble. And Europe is in a serious trouble. As a consequence, because they've made all these appalling decisions so that inflation is terrible here. Everyone says, prices in the shops have just doubled in this period. I think there are 8 million Italians now under the line of poverty because it just doesn't, they're not, and all the socials, all the safety net that after the war, which was a good idea, but went wrong, and now it's all gone anyway.
Right. And now it's all, and now their only option is to reset the system financially and wipe the debt out and push it off into perpetuity. This is the Soros model of how they can transition everybody to perpetual debt and then just wipe the balance sheets clean and start all over again. And they really did think that they still believe that they can pull this off while at the same time, creating political gridlock in the United States, which forces us to spend money we don't have on, maintaining an empire we can't afford. And this is where I come right back to what I've been saying about Jerome Powell.
I just want to intercept, but I mean, if you go down what they're suggesting of sort of wiping out debt and sort of going like this, a digital economy, you'll end up with something like San Francisco, but across the whole of, whole of Europe, people on, support incomes and basic income models and things like that. And what do? They sit on the pavement and smoke pot and take drugs and things because there's no employment. There's nothing.
I know.
No
and
well-plain employment.
The model for them has always been the Pixar movie WALL-E. They just see us as people sitting around waiting for the world to be rebuilt, sitting in lounge chairs, drinking soda and watching movies all day while the robots do all the work. And they're insane if they think that that's going to sustain itself in any kind of real economy. It's not. And
what you saw in France will be the consequences. This is what will come. People get angry and frustrated, and they've got nothing to lose, and they will just go and break it down. And the point I wanted to make was, which is a very important one, which I wrote about in the last article that I wrote, was saying, it's a myth to think that if you haven't got, if you like, civil society, organized civil society, that you're safe. That actually all of the communist states, except Poland, were brought down by street protest. There were no organized civil societies there. They didn't exist. It's not, and the EU thinks that, providing we repress the protests severely enough and control the narrative through the mainstream media, we're okay. But that is not the case. And it's been part of our sort of, regime change. We need civil society in Russia. We need Navalny, all of this sort of thing. But actually, if you look at the history, it was never the case that you had. So they've got rid of the political parties. But that's what you see in France is what brings down states more than anything else. And the key thing which happened in France is they lost control of the enforcers. They lost the police and of the military. They've lost the support of these people. Macron has lost the support.
Yeah, no, that's very key. And you once you lose that, and once the police and the military start siding with the people, the government doesn't have very much long to live. Yeah, no, and we shouldn't be shocked that it's France. That is the first to go here, because this is what the modern conservative American, or even the modern American, has this idea that the French are, weak surrender monkeys, right? And all this stuff, which is nonsense, of course. But the French have a very, very strong sense of cultural identity of being French, and being French means something and they're willing to throw a party, as it were, to remain being French, and it's still there, deeply embedded in, I'm not, and in no way, manner, shape, or form I'm not denigrating that. Like, it just makes perfect sense that strong sense of being French is going to translate into, oh, you want to take France away from us? Yeah, no. And
today, Tom, Today, by the way, is Bastille Day.
Exactly. We're doing this on Bastille Day, right?
Bastille Day. So you just better explain to the listeners what Bastille is.
That's the day that the French Revolution that they started. Like, this is their independence. This is their July 4th.
Storm the establishment.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll cue up the Rush song from 1975, and we'll get started. So artist Jordan Peterson put it the other day: let them eat solar panels. So I this is, and I think it's actually, this is, you reach these moments where if you invite chaos into your system in order to try and affect change, which is what these idiotic Davosians have done, right? These people from Davos, the West, they figured, well, never let a crisis go to waste. The Rahm Emanuel thing, never, invite a little chaos, and then in the chaos, then that's when you can take over and you can erect new structures and you can start to move people where they want to go. But there comes a point where chaos is chaos, and chaos by definition can't be controlled. And once you get the system, you can get a little bit of chaos is fine, but once it starts to, really get out of whack, you can't put it back in. You can't put that genie back in the bottle, and then the whole thing explodes. And so they've always had a very poorly thought out strategy, and they've always had an overinflated sense of their own sense of control over how they manufacture consent and manufacture choice for us.
And that's, and you'll understand this better than anyone. I mean, the economic problems of Europe are structural. A little bit of a twist here or a tweak by the European Central Bank is not going to solve the problem, because there are structural problems. The contradictions within the economy are structural.
Yes.
And you can't change that by upping or downing interest rates a few percent here or there. It's not going to solve it. And that's why they are trapped, and they are getting very frightened about it. Yes. And they're frightened too, because I think that what they see is that the rest of the world no longer believe in European values. They don't believe in the European narrative, that we have got some sort of civilizational DNA advantage. They just don't accept that. You Europeans have your own problems. We're not interested in what your war in Ukraine. We're on the other side, we have our own interests, and good luck with yours. And it's a big change, because our financial system depends on the myth of the Western cultural superiority. And as soon as that goes with it goes not only just political hegemony, but financial hegemony.
Well, and then this is the thing that's been driving me crazy, is to watch these things play out. So since last fall, we've been watching the European Union pull back financially from the brink of collapse, which is when the euro hit 96 cents and bond spreads were collapsing and everything, and oil prices came under extreme pressure to the downside it was very clear that the next phase of the sanctions regime, starting in about September of October of last year, would be to push the Russians into bankruptcy by capping the price of oil. It was also done to quell domestic inflation in the United States and Europe, because they understood that most of this inflation was a commodity cost push variety, meaning as commodity prices went up, it pushed costs up because there was too much money chasing not enough commodities. People need food, people need energy, yada, yada, yada. And so the big pump and dump that has happened in commodity prices over the last 18 months have now reached the end of the terminal rate of where they can manage inflation, right? So they're patting themselves on the back for getting inflation mostly under control, because here's the messaging narrative difference, right? Powell has understood this problem from the beginning. He's said, if you listen to him carefully, I don't have the tools to fight this inflation, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. But I'm going to raise interest rates. Yes, it's to get inflation under control, but he's always expected inflation to drop off year over year, because eventually baseline effects would just do the work for him. All he had to do was cut the froth off the top of the credit markets, and inflation in the United States would come down as the Biden administration manipulated the price of oil down, and that would manipulate down the price of gasoline, and eventually it would push through the entire system, especially given the fact that commodity prices in early 2022 were at unsustainable highs. So it was not hard from a simple projection of how we calculate the CPI to say we're going to get inflation under control if we raise interest rates, and we'll look like the philosopher kings that we say we are. The problem, of course, is that for Lagarde, she's been the one that has had to admit she has a structural inflation problem she can't get rid of, right? European inflation is still running 6%. Germany's still running 6%, blah, 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 blah. And it's because they haven't been able to get oil prices, even in euro-adjusted terms, down low enough to get the CPI on a year-over-year basis down. Now oil prices are starting to rise again, because now any belief in a drop-off in the supply and demand mismatch in energy, a potential oil glut because of a global recession, is fading. Not because the global economy is in great shape. It's not, but it's simply because OPEC has cut production. U.S. Production is starting to peak. Biden has drained the SPR and needs to refill it. Like, everybody is starting to start to position long oil, and they can't get around it. That is only going to exacerbate Lagarde's problem structurally, and it's only going to exacerbate all the things you just talked about domestically in terms of domestic stability. She's going to have to continue raising interest rates. But if she raises interest rates too far, and Powell doesn't even have to raise at this point, she's going to have to raise, because she's at negative 4% with a 6% CPI at 2.5%. She's at negative minus 3.5%. Powell's at plus 2%, right? Plus 2.5%, right? So he's got real positive yields. He's got, a situation that's conducive to capital inflow. She's at negative 3%. She's at a situation conducive to capital outflow, and she needs to raise interest rates to maintain what's left of her tattered credibility. She does that, she just torches all of the European banks and all of the European central banks.
Exactly.
When a German auditor come out and say that the Bundesbank is effectively bankrupt and needs a bailout from the $3.5 trillion worth of European sovereign debt that it's bought over the last few years, and that is now all so far underwater, it's wiped out all the equity in the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank, by the way, which is really the most powerful central bank in Europe, not the ECB.
Yeah.
This is rock meat hard place. You're now in 4 Chinese finger traps at the same time. You can't even wriggle out of one of them. And what you're doing now, everything you do is just like bringing your thumbs closer together to the 5th one, and now you're done. That's the way I see it, Alastair.
No, that's you're absolutely right, and this is why. And I mean, the inflation figures that you're quoting, which are the official ones and massaged, but everyone who lives in Italy knows that, the food prices are going up at such an incredible rate, but everything in the shop is double in this last period. And you get ripped off. I mean, I lived for a while in Brazil. The economists just don't grasp that once inflation reaches a certain point, psychology takes over.
Yes.
You don't make money by selling goods anymore. You take money by taking them off the market,
yes,
and keeping them and then putting them back a month later and charging a whack for the inflation. And then it becomes an established habit and a process, and then it's impossible to stop it. I mean, it's because it's psychologically sort of embedded in people, and it's happening here every day. They don't even wait to find out what the prices is. They just stick them up every week. They just put them up automatically and make a big profit. They're making more profit from just putting the prices up every month than they were making before when they just sold a higher volume of goods.
And they need to do that because they don't know where when the next supply run is going to come from.
Exactly. You don't know where it was. I mean, and things don't go up a small amount. You want to get some wood or something, wood chips for things like that. It's at what was sort of 90, what was 100 euros last year is 250. It goes from 100 to 250 just like that. So, people are really at the moment, I don't want to suggest that the Italians are in sort of a revolutionary mode. Still, mostly they're asleep. I mean, a lot of them are still sort of slumbering on like most of the world and haven't really wakened up. But it's changing, and it's changing everywhere in Europe. People are beginning to sort of, because reality, facts in the ground are confronting them, that their income just doesn't buy enough food. I mean, one of the most important things that you see in France is a complete fall off in people buying food. It's dropped down lower than it's ever dropped down. Now, it's not just that they're sort of giving up the little luxury brie or something like this for something else. I mean, they are not buying food.
Yep.
Europe has to, European leaders who are pathetic they've taken every wrong decision. And now they're facing the consequences of this. And I just don't know what they think they're going to do. But that's going to, not in the same way, but it is going to sort of impact into the United States too.
Of course it is.
As well, because the financial systems are too intertwined. Yes. I mean, there is going to be exposure in the United States to European banks, and we're going to have a credit crunch. I mean, there'll be a credit crisis, I think, coming soon.
The big question is going to be this is part of this is you just brought something up which actually adds yet another, well, not yet another, but another small argument as to why I think Powell is going to shock markets and not raise rates in 2 weeks, because he doesn't need to, and because he has to allow more time for the U.S. financial system to digest the push off of LIBOR onto SOFR, to push off onto to deal with the rapidity of his interest rate hikes, and now to deal with balance sheets, issues, and start to allow the restructuring of American banks to roll off for another 6 to 8 weeks until we get to the post Labor Day, Fed meeting in September, and give it a couple. He's got the wiggle room to give the United States a couple more months to deal with this, and Lagarde doesn't. She's furiously maintaining credit spreads in every way, and she's calling in every marker. And I'll be honest with you, I think Janet Yellen's trip to Beijing paid dividends on that front. And this is part of the reason why we're seeing the dollar getting crushed right now, because everybody coordinated to buy U.S. Treasuries because Janet Yellen was flooding the market with them. And we can't afford to have any more liquidity drained from the domestic economy by having her issue $1 trillion worth of treasuries to refill the TGA. So she rang up the foreign investors. Now you can get the ECB to do it because they're desperate to maintain credit spreads. And you can get the BOJ to a certain extent to intervene in the yen. The big one was going to be China. And that's why Yellen went to Beijing, and that's why the dollar fell off a cliff, like on the hour that she met with Xi.
Yeah, it's the repeat of the visit to Saudi Arabia in the 70s, when they said, please buy US treasuries. This is what we want you to do. We've got to buy them for, we're going to agree a petrodollar system, and you're going to have to buy US treasuries. What's going to happen? What's the quid pro quo is that Xi extracted from Yellen during that meeting? Well, exactly. And I don't think it is that if she asked them to sort of go slow on what happens with the BRICS, I mean, all I see is the Chinese moving ahead on that. They want it. They're encouraging everyone to, it's such a simple message, and they don't get it in the West. What's the message that people are saying? You want autonomy, you want sovereignty. Well, the first way to get sovereignty is stop using dollars. That gives you sovereignty back to a certain extent, if you can find the means of doing it. What has been the hegemony that you've all suffered? Sanctions, secondary sanctions, financial restrictions, all of these things. You want to be sovereign and free and independent? Stop using the dollar. It's irresistible, isn't it? I mean, rich Gulf states, they can say, okay, but they're actually all on board on it too.
Right. No, I agree with you. Now I will say a couple of things here about this, because this is a point I've been making for a while. De-dollarization as a theme it's not happening as fast as people want us to believe it's happening. It's happening and it's going on, but it's now all of a sudden, when I was talking about de-dollarization 10 years ago, everybody thought I was a crank. Today, it's now, I'm getting the proverbial shoe shine boy coming up to me and go, so what do you think about de-dollarization? I'm like, really? Okay. So I think it's one of those things where, if you want my honest opinion, I think I think the people who benefit most from de-dollarization are the very people we were just talking about previous to the Chinese, and which is the Europeans. They're the ones, because in order for the euro to survive, the dollar has to be trashed. Whereas the East, everybody east of the international north-south transport corridor is saying, look, we're just jacking out of your old system, and we will leave bridges between them for us to do business, but we're going to settle our trade and account for our trade differently. And that's what the BRICS announcement is going to be. It's not going to be, oh my God, all of a sudden they went on the gold standard. That's just dumb. That's dumb gold bug talk.
They're not going to do that. I mean, but people don't really even understand that Russia did go on a form of gold. They linked the ruble to a gram of gold. You did an excellent piece on that. One of the first people who picked it up, what the difference it made. Not that, you agreed to change every ruble for gold or all that nonsense. They don't want to be the reserve currency. The last thing the Chinese or the Russians want is to be a reserve. The Americans can keep it.
Yes, as far as they're concerned. And now you've got a Fed chair that doesn't want it. Yeah. I mean, you literally have a Jerome Powell is like, no, there's plenty of room for more than one reserve currency in the world. Translation, we can't afford this anymore.
Yeah.
No, what the Russians are doing is similar to, you can just see the foundations are being built all across Asia.
Yeah. And the next bit of it,
to build the institutions necessary to replace ours.
And the next bit of it goes back to what the Americans did at the end during this sort of war period. I can't remember exactly what you called them, but you suddenly, before they were only instruments within the financial systems, and you introduced something like war bonds or something like that. I can't remember what they were called. You must correct me on what.
I think war bonds is exactly correct.
War bonds, and people bought them because they were, pred. Well, in the rest of the world, there is a feeling that this is like a new independence era we're in, where we are getting rid of colonialism, we're getting rid of it. And, they will be able to construct some form of bond market, quite simply by saying to people, we're going to issue the bank, the ECB, the BRICS bank is going to say, we're going to issue these bonds. Why don't you buy them to support sovereignty, that we're going to become sovereignty and get away from the West.
And we'll use those, and we'll use the proceeds from those bonds to invest in your countries.
Yeah.
It's tied to the BRICS Development Bank and all the rest of it.
I don't think it's going to be so. Everyone says, oh, they haven't got a market. They'll never have a market.
No,
well, America didn't have a market then. There was nothing, but they made it.
Now, one of the things that it's funny, I did a long podcast with Vince Blanchi and Palisades Gold Radio, which Tom gave me the audio from, and I published it so that I had it here in the Gold Goats and Guns podcast. In episode 150, the first 15 minutes, Vince just goes through the mechanism by which the whole system, the whole supply chain for changing one market to the other, regardless of what it is. He's the gold market as an example of how you do that. And it's just slowly but surely, there is a financial supply chain that happens for all of the supply, and in order to create a market somewhere. And it happens by degrees, step by step, over time. And this is what is happening. And for me, the model is what China did with the Shifi oil contract back 10 years ago, and ensuring that, there was a link to getting your money out of China, your profits out of China in gold and stored in Hong Kong. And so you can get it out, you can get your profits out so you can invest, so you can go in and buy oil and trade oil in Shanghai, but you can book profit if necessary in gold, which what does that do? It creates a level of trust that was never, that the Chinese hadn't earned yet, right?
Yeah.
You got to do that. And then eventually the whole thing just starts to turn over. And then you get every bit of the supply chain of the swaps necessary and of the vaulting and the this and the that and all the things necessary to get the work done. And eventually you wind up with a real market, all co-located with the exchange. And the same thing is going to happen to the BRICS. The Russians are doing the exact same thing now in the oil industry, building out their financial markets in Moscow, creating an oil index, creating a link to trade, to have a gold exchange, to have a this, to have that, all those things in order to build trust within the financial community that does business with Russia, two-way trade with Russia, international trade, and eventually they'll build it. And it's going to take time. But but gold is the trusted asset that undergirds the entire thing. Yeah. And it then becomes the final account, and then ultimately it becomes the final accounting for national governments, and it's all tokenized. That's what's coming. And
I mean, that's what you predicted when they said we will buy so many, we will buy at this rate for 1 gram of gold, and of course it had an immediate effect. People stopped exporting, getting rid of their rubles overseas, and they felt that there was something, inherent value that somehow was back in it from a commodity, either from oil or from gold. It had a link to real value.
Yeah, exactly. And it works out perfectly there, so that this is what's happening. This is why it's not going to be a kind of big dramatic thing, right? Don't expect for it to be, but it's just them saying, look, we're going to build an entirely different system. And I firmly believe that Powell has to respond to that. Yeah. And the ECB doesn't have an answer to this other than to, send their apparatchiks over to the Chinese and beg for some help. And,
beg them for help. At the same time, Europe tells them about how much they disapprove of their values.
Of course,
and that they have to learn to be more like us. And the Chinese look at them and they say, "Mr. Borrell, your trip to Beijing has just been cancelled. So sorry."
Yeah. Well, remember when von der Leyen and Baerbock and Macron went to Beijing a couple of months ago, and what happened? Baerbock and von der Leyen went in and lectured them about, about human rights and European values and everything else. And Macron walked in and went, how about buying some Airbus A320s? We could really use the business. So he went in and played good cop to their bad cop. To me, it was like, the cynic in me said good cop, bad cop. The way things have worked out since then, it may even just be Macron desperately trying to keep parts of his industrial and military industrial complex on side, because he understands that this whole European project is on its last legs, and therefore, it's time for France to start declaring independence as well, or his head's going to wind up in the news.
Yep, that's right.
So,
that's right.
All right. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about this morning before we head out?
No. I mean, I think covered quite a lot. What was so good is, because I try and do it, but you've been doing it as well, is to try and tie things, the financial and the geopolitical together. I keep saying to people, and they say, oh, well, but Russia hasn't recovered ground in Ukraine. And I say, but what was the first front? What was the main front of the war on Russia? It was financial war.
Yes.
And they won that. What was the second front? Diplomatic isolation. And they've won that.
Yes.
And what was the third one? That you were going to stop buying their oil and that they would just be awash with unsaleable oil. And they've won that one too. And there they are sitting at their defense lines. And the Ukrainians have not even captured a single village outside of those defense lines at this stage. It's been an extraordinary, because I will say this, because we've had all of this nonsense about how the Russians have no military, and it's like the Soviet Union, and it's sort of rigid. And they've actually been very innovative in this, and they've had a remarkable coordination across all these different, missiles from here, drones, all these things, the electronic warfare, everything has worked together. Of course, there have been slips up at times, but like in any system. But it really has been a remarkable show. And then for all of those waiting for sort of Moscow to fracture and break up, well, I'm very sorry. It's not happening. His ratings have gone up. Putin's ratings have gone up after. And people, I think the intelligence services were completely sort of bouleversed by what had happened with Prigozhin. They got it, they misassessed it. They were briefing the Gang of Eight, they were briefing prime ministers and everyone. Oh, watch this weekend.
And
anyway.
I just, it's funny, Alastair. I know that you have, your first part of your career is in intelligence services, and I look at the situation and I think to myself, well, there's really no embassy anymore. There aren't very many diplomats on the ground, or even diplomats. I use my air quotes for diplomats. There are no journalists on the ground because the NGOs have all been kicked out. And I use my air quotes for journalists as well. Like, I just don't believe anybody. Like, if you look at the recent history of quote unquote color revolutions and of that type of insurgencies against the Russian underbelly, all the way from Belarus all the way out to Kazakhstan. Like, how many of them have succeeded recently? None of them. And because none of them have succeeded, you have to conclude that the ground game for our intelligence services in the West in these places is really weak. Well, if it's weak in Belarus and it's weak in Kazakhstan, then do you think what do you think it looks like in Moscow?
I just finished, because I know you wanted indeed to get away and things, but just finished that, the whole thing changed really. We saw it in Iraq with the big change when, was it Brenner who was posted at the sort of, vice regent of Iraq in 2006. And he came in and he said, I know nothing about Iraq. I know nothing of its history. I know nothing of its culture. And this is great because it allows me to do things from scratch, and this is how it's going to be. And of course it was, and they did the same, all the people who knew about Russia in these places, the diplomats who'd actually been down and talked on the streets with people. It used to be like that in embassies, the ambassador dealt with the government, but you had people out everywhere across the board listening and hearing what was going on. Oh, all of that it's not necessary. If you understand the nature of Russians, that's all you need. I mean, you don't have to, I mean, you know, like Iranians can't be trusted, Iranians can't be trusted, they're deceitful, they're people you can't. I mean, why bother to study? What's the difference between Sunnism and Shiism? I don't think you need to know this. This is a law and order issue. I mean, this is what they were saying, you know. I mean, all of that. And so we live in this hubris, in this incredible delusion. And my worry, and that I'll leave it on that thing, and coming in August, perhaps, is, you know, the trouble is that exiting from delusion is a slower timeline than events on the ground.
Yes.
And that can lead to real problems because most of Europe, anyway, I can't speak for America, but at what I see, I mean, people still come up to you and say, but the Ukrainians are winning, aren't they? And you say, well, you know, okay.
No.
I mean, and the Russians are losing and there's going to be a revolution in Russia. Well, okay. But I mean, all of that is gone and we live in this delusion. And recently the Daily Telegraph put up this wonderful video. You ought to look at it, just 9 minutes. And it argued that wars are won by narrative. What you have to have is a narrative that extends from the special forces in the field right up to the top of the political, and everyone has to speak according to a unitary narrative and not demand it. And our narrative is better. That's why we're going to win. Theirs is clunky. That's what they said.
That's well.
That's the delusion.
So never a better example of policy set by an intelligence service hubris, right? Unbelievable. I haven't seen that, but I'm not surprised in any way, manner, shape, or form. And what's really funny is that, yeah, well, it depends on, you know, even just to take their argument as given. Okay. Yeah. Okay, fine. Your narrative is better here where they're not fighting and where nothing matters. Their narrative, the Russians' narrative, is clearly winning in Saudi Arabia, Iran,
everywhere.
India, everywhere else, Brazil, blah, 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 all the way down the line, the whole of OPEC. Yeah. Okay. So, but you know, like all the stands are on Putin's side now, and this is undoing 30 years worth of work 50 years worth of work by the intelligence agencies to turn them against the Russians, and then everything else, and even like Aliyev in Azerbaijan is having to come to the rapid conclusion that tomorrow his tomorrow is based on his relations with the Russians and the Iranians, or whether he likes it or not. And he can't triangulate with the Turks anymore. It's just not going to work. So yes. So that is the big worry. And then the other big worry, of course, is that that coming down from delusion, if it doesn't happen fast enough, means that somebody will authorize something really freaking dumb and move us past the point of no return. And so while all the pieces are in place for the kind of the end of NATO, the end of Ukraine, this, that, everything else, these people are facing an existential crisis that is deep in the bowels of their being, that go back hundreds of years. And they're not going to give that up lightly. And so we have to keep watching very carefully. In my mind, this is what I've been doing, to watch for instances and signs where those that are opposed to them escalating beyond a point of no return win. And if they win little battles, it turns into big battles. It turns into big things like Vilnius. And I think that that's probably the takeaway from the entire kind of last year and a half of geopolitics. And let's just hope that these people at 5.5% interest rates finally get a finite number of at-bats as opposed to an infinite number of ones, right? Because that's the way we're seeing it. So thank you, Alastair. This has been absolutely wonderful. I'm glad that we had a chance to catch up. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really glad that you're feeling better so that we can actually do this more often, because it would be great to catch up on a regular basis. So thank you. Well, that'll about wrap it up for episode 151 of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank Alastair Crooke for his cogent and sober analysis, as always. You can follow my work over at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728, where the very worst version of me shows up on a daily basis. And of course, you can sign up for the Patreon service at Patreon/Gold, Goats, and Guns, where you can sign up for either the twice weekly market reports and private blogs, or you can add in the Gold, Goats, and Guns investment newsletter, where Dexter White and I tie all of these geopolitical and financial ideas into a coherent and cogent portfolio strategy to help you make sense of all of this craziness. So with that said, I'm out for today. You guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.